Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel. It's looking at the idea of South Asian architecture and urbanism, and we've invited two very interesting speakers here. The panel is called of Densities, Intensities, Entanglements, and Cacophonies. Um, Before I start the introduction, let me just introduce the two speakers. Sorry, just give me a minute. So Shandana Yusuf is one of the speakers, and sorry, I'm a little disorganized here. Shandana Yusuf is an associate professor of architectural history and theory at the School of Architecture, University of Utah. She's currently the Coletta A. Doolin Foundation Fellow at Clark Institute in Williams College, Massachusetts. Here she's finishing the manuscript for her third book project, The Resonant Tomb, a feminist history of Sufi shrines in Pakistan. Previously, she had published Broadcasting Buildings, Architecture on the Wireless, and her scholarship juxtaposes colonial, post-colonial history with sound studies in architecture, framing each as a force of globalization. I'll also like to invite Munim. Munim Wasif is also a dear friend. He's an artist. He's a photographer and also the trustee of one of the most famous schools in Dhaka called the Pathshala, which many of us know. So Munim's project is really interesting. He also showed recently in Mumbai at a gallery. That's where I met him. So Munim's going to share his work on the city of Puran Dhaka, which he calls a place of entanglements, and we'll see that through some of his work. Located between this, what he calls the glorious past and breakneck flux of recent developments, he starts looking at the city through his photographs, through films and installations, and understanding the city, rediscovering it from several vantage points, which he's sort of explored over the last 2 decades. His work unentangles the city's multiple idiosyncrasies and the shifts within that, perpetually connecting the artist to the city and its people. Shandana's work, we also find is very, very interesting, and in some ways, re-looking at sites that in many ways have been seen as cacophonous, and through, in some ways, through the kind of modernist lens. She looks at the city of so the Sevan Sharif in Pakistan, and really sort of looks very closely at what are the the kind of affects that it produces, and rereading it through the idea of a feminist history, a kind of rereading it through the lens of feminist histories. And we've thought that both of these were very important projects to, in some ways, rethink the epistemes through which South Asian architecture and urbanism has been seen so far. And I think I'll just kind of lay some of the coordinates of this discussion before I bring some of the research that we've been doing at the school as well, and to sort of also frame it around this particular exhibition that happened at MoMA last year. It was called the Project of Independence, Architectures of Decolonization in South Asia, 1947 to 1985. And there, what the curators did was they conceptualized a South Asian modernity that worked towards what they called producing a powerful vision of a self-determined post-colonial society. And they argued, what they argued there was that the tenets that this South Asian modernity was built on the tenets of cosmopolitanism, secularism, and the particularities of place. Now, some of our own arguments have been that often a lot of this modern architecture that comes to South Asia is in some ways also stylistic, but also in some ways following a kind of developmentalist trajectory, which in many ways erases some of the ways in which this South Asian cities are lived, and other ways in which inhabitations happen. And I think what this kind of question of looking at entanglements and cacophonies and that both of you bring to the project is in some ways taking us away a little bit away from this whole developmentalist logic through which we otherwise see South Asian sites, but also starting to look at cacophonies, entanglements, probably also through some forms of ways of kind of looking at productively inhabiting sites. So I think we can open up the discussion there and see what more or what else can we open up in the ways we kind of look at South Asian sites, and what are some of the other epistemes through which we can sort of look at these sites as productive ways of knowing. So with that, I would invite Munim first, and then Chandana, and then I hope to kind of come back with some of the research that we've been doing and some of the ideas that we've been working with to in some ways open up some of these epistemic spaces. So thank you.
Thank you, Rupali, for inviting me to speak here. I'm not an architect. I'm an artist. Primarily, I work with lens-based media, photography, film, and installation. And one of the places that I always went back for my work is old part of Dhaka that we call Puran Dhaka. And my work actually have grown over the last 20 years, which means it shifted and taken new forms every time I went back. And I published a book called Belonging after walking in the streets of Old Dhaka for 12 years. And after publishing the book, I realized that I didn't really manage to capture the essence of the city. So this tendency of going back and listening to different kind of senses and noises of the city was my core interest. And I never looked at this work as a project. This was something very close to my heart. And I always was inspired to see things which are not perfect in the old part of the town. And I believe that in different places in South Asia, people actually have celebrated this imperfection in a very living way, not by putting it in boxes in museums or by looking at from ethnographic gaze, but through living through it. So I will just share my screen and share a little bit of my practice. Can you see my screen? Yes. And I just had a show actually a few months back in Project 88 in Mumbai, which is also it has a very interesting architecture because it was an old printing press, and I was glad that it was not completely changed and turned into a sterile white cube. It still has residue of what was there before. And the reason the name of the exhibition is called Chromo Show, because it completely represents my practice. Chromo Show in Bangla, it means, in English, it means step by step. In Bengali, it means how gradually something develops or take a form. And for me, that way of looking at it was very, very crucial. So I walked in the streets of Old Dhaka and mostly produced black and white images from 2001 to 2012 for almost 12 years. And I was really interested how people were living within this complex architectural spaces in Old Dhaka, which was always a camouflage. Like one part of the building might have a Mughal architecture or a French architecture or leftover of a Jamidar villa, and the second part of the building might be a new architecture which is completely shifted. So it was never a perfect scene, but what I was interested in, how people were inhabiting these spaces. And in a lot of these spaces, more than one family lives, sometimes 15-20 family lives, and they share their spaces. They share the space where they take bath, where they cook, where they play. They share the stairs, they share the rooftops. So these overlaps of private and public spaces was extremely crucial to me. And I was also looking at this multiple living in the same space in the city, while someone having a cup of tea in the rooftop on the back, you see different generation is jumping and getting into maybe a different direction. This place is very specific and special. The name of this place is called Beauty Boarding, which is an old boarding house in Bangla Bazaar, where we mostly have our publishers and printing presses. And in early 80s, all the famous writers and poets used to hang out in these places. And still that place exists. And the guy who is sitting in the middle and cleaning the fish, his name is Bimal, someone who's very close to me. And while he prepares and cleans food every day, he feeds to the crows and the cats and the dogs. And it's almost like a very informal daily ritual. But for me, that relationship, that's living together was very important. And also, because of these shared spaces, how you see also very private moments overlapping, either through families or through generations. And I was always interested in these overlappings because the more we have grown as a modern city in Dhaka and more we have apartments, the more we have isolated and the more we have lost a reason to talk to someone else. And I have grown up in a small town called Kumilla, which is part of larger Tripura. And I have gone in a part of the city where there were a lot of ponds and there were a lot of fields where we have played, we have hangouts. And I was also interested at that period a particular kind of photography which looks at the subtle moments through a particular lens. And the book was published by a publisher called Clementina de la Farauna from Paris. But after publishing the book, I realized that the reason why I was interested in the city, and it took me 12 years or 14 years to realize it, and these are the name of the streets where I have been to, and I found the name of the streets also amazing, and it has so much history of partition of South Asia living together. And I also lived in Old Dhaka for quite a long time. But when I have moved away, I used to actually create a temporary studio in beauty boarding. This is me sleeping in the noon time where the light is harsh, and this is me looking at pictures in the veranda of beauty boarding. And I think for me, one of the crucial things in my practice is you have to actually wake up with the sun where you are walking, and you have to sleep there. Unless you do it and see the space through various lights and noises and silences, it's very difficult to understand the space and how it unfolds in different times. And as I also work as a curator, this is my first exhibition actually in Shakhari Bazaar, which is one of the narrow street in Old Dhaka. And this was the place where they used to do their Durga Puja, which is the main celebration there, where a huge amount of people, or they used to organize a wedding. And I did a project on the jute farmers and the workers for a long time, and this was the place where I did my first solo exhibition. And it was amazing to see the kind of people who were interacting, the way they were interacting with my pictures. So my engagement with that part of city has many kind of direction. It was not only I was photographing that place, but I was involved in various capacities. And 15 years back, there was still this tradition of photographers who used to take pictures with this box camera and creating these paper negatives, especially in front of the court, where people used to need these need to make these quick passport size images. And I've also worked with those photographers and created these paper negatives. And this was his studio. And I was amazed how flexible he was to create his temporary studio, and how quickly he can pack and also move to somewhere else. And then, as I said, after walking many years, I realized that I didn't really manage to capture the exact thing that I was interested in. And I was interested in the whole part of the city because of two writers. One is Akhtaruzzamán Ilyas, another one is Shahidul Johid, two very prominent Bengali writers from Dhaka who have always written on Old Dhaka, but then the stories were not only about Old Dhaka. Old Dhaka was a place. And it took me 15 years to understand that I was interested in the psychological space of the city rather than the geographical space. I was interested in the fictions. I was interested in the magic. I was interested in the myths. And then I produced this short film called Khyal, which is about 4 characters. And all the characters' names comes from also Ilyas' novel, Ronju, Osman Ali. And this is a specific scene which actually haunted me to produce this film. I was interested in all these small characters who lives in Old Dhaka, but lives in some form of isolation. And after being to that part of city for many years, I realized that the city allows you to be someone very unique. Like you can only sell a perfume and still live in one of the rooftop of the city. So the city allows this different small profession to exist. And this is how it was shown in Project 88 in its physical space. And for me, how I show and install my work is also very crucial. How I create space, how I intervene within different spaces. The name Khyal also come from Arabic in generally, but in Bengali, we use the word Khyal in a very interesting way. Usually when someone forgets something, we say, oh, tomar to Khyal nei, ami bolechilam tomake ota ante. So it's also a way of forgetting. But the way of forgetting means you are actually also about thinking about somewhere else. So these 4 characters who lives in Old Dhaka, but think about a different space. So they are physically in Old Dhaka, but psychologically they belongs to somewhere else. And I was interested in that time and space, and how Old Dhaka allows you to be in that time of space of imagination. And these are the 4 characters. In the first, you see Osman Ali, who is resting. Then you see Dadi, who always looks outside of the window. And we don't know what she's actually looking at or where she's looking at. Then you have Nitu, and then you have Ronju talking with the horse. And for me, these doors and windows of these old houses also a way of looking at the another episteme, to think about a different world. These are transitory space. I'm not interested in the heritage part of the architecture. Rather, I'm interested in more fictional part of the architecture, what it allows you to grasp. I will show you just a little clip, maybe just 2 minutes. Sorry. Let me know if here, if you can. Rupali, can't you see?
I think that we can see, but there's no sound. I don't hear any sound right now.
I think the sound is very low.
Okay.
Can you hear now?
Allah banda hayente tebe baraden. Allah banda diler mak pura kurden.
Sorry, I have to share my screen again. Sorry. Can you see the screen? Is it all good? Yeah. So from KL, I produced the film for 3 years, and then I was working on this show, which was supposed to happen, but because of pandemic, it was paused. But I was also interested to revisit the city and see how the city has changed. But while looking at how the city has changed, I realized I have changed as an artist. I don't look at the same things in the same way, and I have developed a different language, and I'm interested in different things. So I started looking at the city, more of the abundant architecture of the city, or what we call, the leftovers, the residues of different things in the city. And I started photographing in color. I was looking at objects. I was looking at more the hybridity of the city, which is very rapid and very important. But I was also interested to put that in conversation with my old work, where I was mostly interested with people, and see when you put these two works next to each other, what it means. That's why the name of the work is called stereo, where you have this two channel of sound going in different direction, but creating a wider depth of how you perceive a space. So this is a photograph which I was taken in my earlier career, maybe in 2001. And the color photograph which I have taken in 2012 of the same space. So there was a well, and the well is shifted now into, you see a different kind of materiality. You see shift of the place, but you also shift how I am looking at the same space from a very different vantage point. And I'm really interested in these contradictions, in these overlaps, rather than looking at a space from one kind of perspective. And a lot of things in my film actually developed from my earlier photographic work. So it has also a reference point. And one of the key things that shifted in the old city that people don't get together and watch any more things in televisions, or maybe they go to cinema, but they spend more time looking at the small screen. And they put the small screen with different things. Here you see on the back, there is a glass. But you see people are obsessed everywhere looking at the screen, but more on a private, it's a more like a private relationship, but they see these things in a public space, you know, while someone's selling a tea, looking at a Hindi song, his mobile, which was a different relationship just a few years back. And I was also interested in different kind of materiality. I was also looking at personal spaces. And also on the other hand, there is a massive amount of destruction happening in the cities, you know, because a lot of these old buildings are recognized as a heritage site, and people who lives in old Dhaka, a lot of times they don't agree with that level, because, you know, there's a house where they're living in and there is no conversation between the architectural community and the people who lives there, or by the government. And a lot of these buildings are demolished by overnight, you know. You will go next day, you will see there is nothing. You will only find bricks left if you're lucky. But I was also interested in some kind of globalized world, you know, that also exists within this what we call Puran Dhaka. That how there are different kind of thing got introduced, from LED lights to digital clocks to these disco balls to many things, and how also it coexists with the natural traditional festivals and other things. And one of the thing I think which is fascinating for me in this old city is this, how there are a lot of things have grown up very spontaneously and not planned. And sometimes it looks almost like noise, but within this noise there is also bits. I call them off bits, like in music, that maybe you don't see, but these off bits are in between. In Bengali, we have a word called ujjo, which means sometimes there are certain pronunciation that you don't pronounce, but it exists between the lines or between the words. And I was also interested in things which are very minute, which are very detailed. So this is, I don't know how to call this in English. This is one of my favorite place in Old Dhaka is saloon, you know, where mostly men goes to cut their hair or hang out. They speak, it's in a mohalla, in an area, it's a hangout place. Of course, I can't go to the beauty parlors inside, but I'm sure those are fascinating too. But here you see leftovers of beard and other things, but also the materiality of these objects. And the moments you sanitize these spaces, of course, there need to be some kind of progression, there need to be some kind of refabrication. But on the name of refabrication, a lot of times we see a complete sanitize a place where life doesn't have the same role anymore. And I was also interesting how different kind of materiality came into the city in last few years. So this was a very traditional jewelry shop, which was broken and is still under construction while I was walking last year. And you see different kind of marks within that space, you know. You see a plastic grass, you see a broken wall, but you see also the leftover colors of the traditional architecture, this blue paint. So I was always interested in these camouflages, contradictions. This is one of the oldest mosque in Koshai Tuli. But even, and the roads are so narrow, only one car can enter. But even in front of that mosque, there's an open space where most of the people hangs out, and you have all the street foods. This is Manushi Cinema Hall. And I'm also, I walk mostly as a photographer, I'm also interested in lights, how lights leaks and how lights overlaps, and how you look at light not directly, but how you also look at the light which falls on the back of your sun, almost like a backlight. But also how light overlaps different spaces and gives you different kind of luminosity and character. Yeah, I guess that's it. That's how I install the walk in Project 88. And in my practice, editing is extremely important, or sequencing, or how you compose the walk. It's not about the single images, it's about the collective, what Rupali says, cacophonies, how it creates a different kind of noise when you see them together, when you see them in conversation. Yes, and that's it. And I can only say that I'm still interested in that space, and I go back and look at different things and produce new work. And there's always a space for a new conversation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ponim. That was really beautiful. I mean, what photographs, amazing photographs. But also ways of seeing, I think, which are really beautiful that you bring, starting with your discussion of the kind of non-binary ways of looking at public and private, the whole idea that these are sites that kind of allow simultaneously the kind of production of the individual, but also the collective. And when I kind of laid out the first, like the whole idea of how South Asian architecture has been seen as the site of producing self-determination. I think there's already the self-determination in these sites that we speak about, and in some ways, what is it that then how does one look at the modern subject as opposed to these multiplicities of lived experiences and multiple subjectivities that the sites that we just saw bring. But also, I think one really important, like the kind, I was really intrigued with this idea of the stereo, and this idea of seeing simultaneously. It almost reminded me of the miniature paintings, and a kind of episteme where you start looking at things simultaneously, as opposed to the perspectival image where you are privileging one point of view. What does it mean to think of this kind of the stereo vantage point, or this kind of multiple ways of looking at, and you brought in this kind of looking at different times together, different vantage points together. So I think there's something there to draw from in terms of how do we see these new sites. And I think there's so much more, but I'm going to stop there. I'll let Chandana come in, and then we'll probably come back and look at what are some of the coordinates of the discussion here, and what one can actually bring to really kind of looking at South Asian sites from here. So thank you so much, Ponim, and Chandana, I'll welcome you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Munim. This was a gorgeous presentation. Rohit, could you share the slides, please? And then I'll just let you know when to move. Thank you so much. From the first one, this is my last slide. Yeah, from here. Thank you so much. All right. Well, thank you, Rupali and Rohit, for the invitation. I appreciate everyone who's listening for the opportunity to introduce my work on what I'm doing on sound, space, and gender to you. And it's actually very reassuring to be in the company of architects. And now I know, like, also artists, photographers, in what I imagine to be one of the loudest cities in the world. After all, in South Asia, our cultural motto is, why speak softly if you can scream, right? So I am not surprised that it is a South Asian school, SEA, spearheading a symposium that interrogates the power and energies encoded in noise, as opposed to finding ways of quietening the city. Next slide, please. I think this is something, Rohit, next, if you could move on. So,
Rohit, sorry, just let me.
Okay, no, we missed a slide, sorry. Yeah, okay. So I think like this idea of quietening the city, which actually Munim also addressed, all right? So we should leave this to the Europeans, because they have been campaigning to turn the city into a library for reading and contemplation since the Renaissance, when intellectuals started living in cities in significant numbers. Before that, they would live in the countryside, right? Neil Atkinson's brilliant book, The Noisy Renaissance, kind of details out the Eurocentric opposition between noise and thinking. Can you go to the next slide, please? I see this opposition, and I think Munim's work showed it beautifully, but I see this opposition enfolded. Next slide. The different ways of being in the world in literate and oral societies, predominantly literate versus predominantly oral societies. I'm wondering if the slide could move. Scribes need quiet, while peasants are usually considered to sing and dance. Rohit?
Yeah, I've moved ahead. Can you see it?
No, it's still the same place.
On my screen, it's next. Should I?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, let's do it like this. So could you go to slide 3, please? Oh, so then it's, okay, yeah, thank you. So let's leave it like this so it helps. Okay, so then in this opposition between the global north is dominated by the literate community, whereas the south is culturally governed by orality, right? And I think nobody showed it more beautifully than I would say in the last presentation. So this symposium, in my mind, kind of contributes to this growing focus in art and architectural history on sensory histories, on archaeoacoustics and listening communities. This is particularly good news for those of us, as you would see in this panel, who are studying the production of space in the global south, in informal economies, poor women, and others operating in oral and auditory registers first, as opposed to written registers, right? So for their roles in the history of architecture cannot be fully captured when we consider architecture as a stilted arts, as opposed to a robust, forever changing directive environment. And I think like what Munim showed was that if photographers want to capture is that they can do it, right? There's nothing about the medium. It is the emphasis on the static image as opposed to an image that has a cacophony in it. Next image, please. Okay, so I want to take this occasion to report on the noise fields of a town called Sehban Sharif in southern Sindh in Pakistan. And this, what I'm presenting to you today, is a material that is part of my book in architectural history entitled Resonant Tomb, a feminist history of Sufi shrines. And it is hardly ironic that I'm completing my manuscript in the quietest library, in the most soft-spoken campus, in the sleepiest town in the United States, in Williamstown, Massachusetts. So I'm in a very different context than Munim and all of you guys. So next slide, please. So Sevan Sharif, an ancient Shiva center. So Sevan comes from Shivan, right? Shivas. And so is merely a small town of today of 41,250 residents. But it is the most cacophonous city in Pakistan, right? And residents insist that it's a city that has never slept. And its clamorous round-the-clock soundscapes is organized around this resonant tomb that you see I have encircled on the right at the end, the back end of the horizon, which is the resonant tomb of a very irreverent Sufi saint, Osman Varvandi. He was from Iran, who came here in 1251 and died in 1274. And Sevan, as you can see, is on the border of Rajasthan and towards, no, it's not close to the border, but on the Indus. Next slide, please. So every evening in that tomb, in that shrine, every evening in the twilight hour between sunset and nightfall, which is Maghrib, right? Just after the Maghrib call for prayers, the mood of the tomb suddenly changes, right? Deafening drums and bugles reverberate the courtyard of the shrine. And you can see the image of the right, on the right, how many people just kind of gather in that space every evening, right, for 1 hour. This musical hour is the primary attraction of the city. Next slide, please. The particular type of drums and bugle employed here were actually war instruments in medieval and early modern India. They are showcased in Mughal miniature paintings, and you can see how cacophonous the scene on the right is, right? It is almost like the photographs that Munim shared with us, the very loud photographs of the young boys playing together. They were used, these are men killing one another, by the way. So they were used to galvanize these drums and direct the troops on the battlefield. In Sevan, however, they momentarily moved the center of the mausoleum from the grave, which is right next door, that you can see that woman and man in blue walking towards the door. And then so they move that center from there into this courtyard for an hour every day. And so in Sevan, they kind of like the center moves and it vibrates and throbs the walls and hearts with energy. Next slide, please. So on an ordinary day, just an ordinary day in this courtyard, 25, so this is like 5 minutes before the Tamal, the top left image. And then this is like the minute somebody rings a bugle, a very loud bugle, which is attached, which reverberates the idea of sur, which is the sound that in the Quran, it says like a sur, or like this bugle will announce when all the dead would rise up, right? And this is like 5 minutes later, look at the energy in this place. All these women sit on one side, but the women also enter into the men's side. And on the left are these men, right? So what happens is that on ordinary day, there would be 2,500 men and women who gather together in the courtyard and participate in the ritual dance called Tamal. But on Thursday nights, which is the Friday night, right? So the night before Friday, on Thursday night, the numbers swell up to, in this tiny courtyard, to 7,500 with seemingly little room to move, right? And 2/3 of those who are gathered, so two-thirds of them are women and 1/3 of them are men, right? Men scream these Shia slogans, women weep, right? And some moves while others just listen, right? And they cry and they dance and they sing. Yet others, they're particular set of women, and it doesn't happen for men who just chaperone people who have come there particularly to dance, right? And in this scene, sound, space, and humans get, and I'm going to use the Munim's word of entangled in one another's lives in a number of ways. Next slide, please. So the last time I went there, and I quickly made these plans while I was there. So I am showing you the Tamal Court on the right side and the tomb at the bottom, and then I show you a zoom detail on the right. It's a large space. So it is a space as large that during the Urs, which is the death anniversary of this one saint, Mang dead gazillion years ago, right? 1 million people show up in this city. Right. So this is the courtyard of the Tamal Court, becomes that center. But I haven't gone there during Urs because the last time the Urs happened, there was a bombing there. 3,000 people were injured, and some of them, I think like a couple of hundreds people died there, right? So these have become kind of sites of tremendous fundamentalist violence. But so I went there in March 2022, the last time, and shortly after the azan for the sunset, a large horn invited people to gather for Dhamal, a devotional dance. It is considered a dance of death in which ordinary consciousness dies to give rise to a higher one, right? Dhamal seems to have been integrated into the site since the 16th century during the time of Mughal Emperor Akbar. So even though Dhamal is associated with this saint who introduced this into South Asia, it is actually, we don't have any idea whether it was practiced in this place by the mendicants or the fakirs before that. But now it happens every day, right? So this site, it is performed in 100 feet long and 40 feet wide open-air courtyard that you can see as the Tamal Court. And this has actually since Tughlaq period, so the oldest, this tomb chamber was built in like, when was it? Like 1351 or 1354, when the Tughlaq took over this Sevan and Sindh, and then they, but the most recent transformation of this place happened in 2004. So it has been built and rebuilt and has a lot of fragments and the collage that Munim showed in the city as well. So when the two sides, if you can go to the next slide, right? The two sides in this area kind of, this courtyard is filled on one side with women, and the other side also with women, and the men are sandwiched between the two women zones, right? So I was there, and the women filled both colonnades on the left and the right, and then there was a cloth in the middle and men on the right, and you can see this giant drum, icon of giant drum, which is right next on the threshold of women in the third bay of this courtyard. So some women sat in the veiled section, and you can see my hand-drawn dotted line as like this cloth that I showed you in the previous one. But other women sit among facing men, right? And sometimes they hinder as mixed with men that you'll see. So what happens is, first, can you show the next slide? A copper gong at the entrance fills, that you can see the entrance. There's a gong at this center next to and it goes off and it fills the air. Its delicate ring is overlaid and then taken over the pouncing of a drum. The first drummer beats the large percussion instruments with 2 wooden sticks. I'm not going to share any sound bites with you guys because I'm not as organized as Munim. So both hands hit the stretched cow skin over the drums, right? The cow that gave its life for the drum. These are not sacrificed cows. These are cows that die. Naturally, with the same intensity, because remember, there are lots of Hindus who actually come to this site as well. Half the people are actually Hindus here. It recreates the beating of the drum, the ferocity and vehemence of battle drums. Every few minutes, musicians moved the baton to one another. So there's 7 sets of musicians who beat, because after 3 minutes, you're completely drenched. And they're like these 7 brothers who have been doing this for 14th, 15th century onwards. It's the same, not the 7 brothers, but the same family, right? It's in the same Gharana, and then they move this. So what happens is men and women, their ecstatic cries of "O Ali, Ya Hussein," right? And every few minutes, as the musicians move the baton to one another, the tapping becomes more variegated and artful and kind of Chishti music. And these guys have nothing to do with Chishtis. These are Kalandris. That music comes in, so you can see the flow of different Sufi traditions into one another. The rhythm becomes more colorful. Big drums are joined by a set of small ones, and a bugle with melodious tune kind of dampens the ominous quality of the open thumping, right? As instruments multiply and the chorus becomes more nuanced, the crowd becomes more and more animated, and new people join in. People literally faint, start crying, howling. It is a scene beyond scenes, right? So as women do is, so I am talking about kind of how women activate these spaces. As women organize themselves in their designated areas that the officials tell them to take, they deploy different strategies to make the space as theirs, right? As a feminine and feminist space with their bodies. So one thing they do is, sorry, the same slide, please, stay here. So women, as you can see on the bottom left, right, this is inside the tomb, and I'm showing you. They just, and most of these women, and also top right, you can see that they're just sitting on the ground, right? And this is one of a Russian author who wrote about this, and I'm going to take them, right? So this is me talking, sorry. It is common for a lot of women while dancing for the headscarves to kind of fall off their heads, and their hair opens up, and they open up their hair, and then they swing their hair up and down, right? And sweep the floor with their hair. I'm going to show you some images of that. And they repeat the motion till they get dizzy, and till dizziness overcomes them. And this is a quote from a Russian author who was there. Women, and this is a quote, "Women on their knees rotate their heads in a state of frenzy, and their long, loose, flowing hair cuts the air with a whistling sound. Some of them fall into a deep trance and sit slumped on the ground in a catatonic slumber. Each one of these women are here with, who are here are actually, most of them are chaperoned, whose chaperons carry water, sweets, and a leaf of mint and a shawl that they put when a woman falls down or something, and and when they become listless or fall haplessly on the floor and faint. You will see in every bay 3 or 4 fainted women. I'm going to show you some pictures of them. Those with male caregivers sit on the edge right behind the drummers so that the men and the female zone, they could interact. Could you go to the next slide? Very young girls, right? And you can see here where the men and the female in the archway, they meet together. You can see on the top right, a woman kind of like just sweeping the ground with her hair and a chaperone watching over her. You can see the bottom left, a woman kind of thumping her pile or like her anklets on the ground so that she can join in the dance. And then the top left is these people just touching the drum before the singing begins, as if the drum kind of carries the aura or the barakah into their bodies, right, through their hands. So those with the women who, so very young girls, age 13 and onwards, who get kind of fits of depressions, they are usually surrounded by concerned relatives, fathers and aunts alike, when they begin to cry uncontrollably, but to hear what comes out of their cries. So when the music begins, there's a lot of weeping and crying. And so the people come, and the brothers and the fathers and the aunts and the uncles, they all try to listen to what the kid is saying while they're in this ecstatic state. I witness a concerned father and a brother pressing a 15-year-old girl's hands with tremendous concern, and a father pressing his daughter's feet to understand her anguish. Aunts and other kids were also attending to her while her body went into convulsions at the beat of the drums. Each bay, and I can show you these bays on the right bottom slide. So each of these bays has a very different quality. One day in the second bay, on the first beat of the drum, and I have just only shown you the pile of this woman on the left image because it is inappropriate to take photographs of them, and none of these photographs are mine because I hadn't gotten permission from these people when they're in this most vulnerable phase. These are all slides, images that people have uploaded themselves, right? So I'm going to make only drawings of these, and I'm going to make sounds of these because I want to respect the privacy of these characters who actually come to do this thing. So listen to this. So this is what happens, right? I was in this one bay, and so on the second day on the first day in the second bay, on the first beat of the drum, two women at the back of the area started an altercation. The younger one screamed in a shrill voice from the bottom of her gut that every now and then would pierce through my recordings that I'm not sharing with you, so you have to trust me on that. And it pierced through the sea of slogans and music, right? It was incredible. The older woman silently egged her on and did like these strange things that irritated the woman, right? So to bring out all the anger in her. When things got too heated, a neutral third woman intervened. She got them to align their breaths to the drum beat. Once cooled, the hostilities between the two women resumed again. This went on for the entire hour. No one around them paid attention to the scene and just gave them their space. By the end of the hour, the younger one was spent, sweaty, and disheveled. The moderator adjusted her headscarf, and gave both of them the drink. The minute the music ended, both regained their composure, and the three of them thanked the musicians, gave some salutary money, and left, right? Made their way out of the shrine. So it was a scene that they had built of voicing the anger with the drums, using the drums for that. In the fourth bay bay was distinguished by two sets of movement. A mother and an aunt held half the bay for a 24 to 28 years old girl. She was partly Sindhi and partly of Indian origin from Rajasthan, and she wore a hijab and wore kameez shalwar and tied a white cloth around her waist so that her shirt would not rise up as she moved. She did 3 back and forth cartwheels that spanned exactly the bay. It was like the level of precision was unbelievable. And she is moving her body in cartwheels, right? And she's a big girl. So she would take 3 highly controlled, immaculate turns that did not touch anyone around her. She would stop every few turns, then take her breaths and move again, right? And she does this for the entire ritual. Nobody touches her. Right next to her, she shared the bay with 3 people, 2 boys, 2 men who were standing in this, young men. And there's a young girl who's walking between them, an 18-year-old between them. And she was just walking and the guys were pushing her from one side to another. And so her brother told me that she was very powerful. A jinn accompanies her, and she says to me while pointing to her brother, she said to me, I have swallowed up 2 of his younger boys, one at age 2 and the other at age 8. So both of these kids died in their sleep, and everybody was blaming her for this. And she accepted it, and she said, I'm giving penance for their death, right? So she walked for the whole hour till she became dizzy as well. Dizziness is a big thing here. So the last bay also has, like you can see in the small drawing, which I say number 5, it also has a grave in it. And there was a woman who's completely clad. She was wearing a hijab, only her eyes were showing, all in black. And she kept on repeating under the sound of the drums. And she kept on saying, yes, I'm a whore. Yes, I'm a bitch. Yes, I'm a whore. And she would just walk around in this hysterical scene, right? Okay, so next slide, please. So I just want to make some kind of like preliminary deductions on this, because I think I should close here, about the relationship of this devotional music and how women have made it their own, right? One is that women participating in Dhamal exemplify the South Asian woman's traditional claim that she is active, she can decide her needs herself, no bloody psychiatrist is needed, and can do something about this space, about her own needs herself, right? And something that the Muslim patriarchal system denies her. Number 2, Dhamal transforms ordinary women into supernatural women. Far from being passive recipients of Sufi rituals invented by men, women demonstrate a great ability and creativity in making their rituals their own. Unlike the emphasized passivity of women in material culture, and especially by westernized intellectuals and feminists who want to send all these women to school, like my mom, right? Sorry, this is a critique of my mom. So these are like these supernatural women live intensely active life. Critics like my mom who dismiss these dancers and witnesses as deaf followers of tradition, and they say like, oh, these are just like, yeah, these are, what do they know better, right? Actually, I would say that they are deaf to the indigenous ways in which they remake institutions at hand, like Sufism, to work for them. They redress them to suit their needs, not met elsewhere in the society, right? They show tremendous variety and resourcefulness in the production of new rituals for gendered purposes and space. Next slide. 3, these historical agents attuned. These are historical agents because this is an activity that I have traced back to 13th century, right? At least definitely in paintings, but in historical documents, we do see these events happening from Tughlaq period onwards. So these are historical agents. They have a history and they're deeply attuned to the therapeutic effects of drumming, screaming, singing, dancing, chanting, fighting, swinging, right? And exercising the body violently. They're aware of Seven's unique integration of curative power of music with spirituality. 4, women participation in Tamal offers a dramatic contrast to the discourse on women's body in both patriarchal society, the bureaucratic society, and in westernized feminist discourse. Far from being frail and in need of male protection, women demonstrate full possession of their bodies, but only in this precise space, right? Clearly, these are multiple authored bodies. We do know that, right? Embedded within complex networks of society. Deafening music and dancing enables a woman to describe what ails her. The noisy courtyard pulls out of her the diagnosis and suggests the solutions that might suit her. She embodies the refusal to accept arrogant expertise, to submit authority, her authority, and to be treated as subordinate. Tamal at 7 gives women vital help that public health services cannot give. Again, it exemplifies that she can decide her needs for herself and do something about this. And let me go to the next slide, and this is my last point. Finally, none of these claims hold water that I have made, all these claims, none of these claims hold water without the triad of sound, space, and body. In 7, sound is what bridges space and the body. Sound waves involves the dancers with the architecture of the tomb complex and make bass a part of the dancers, right? The dancers in architecture are not distinct entities coming together in a marriage, right? They are mutually constituted. There are 2 distinct things before that, but they become themselves as dancers and a spiritual space only when they are together. They mutually constitute one another. They depend on one another for their existence. Dancing and dancers depend for their corporeal, their body's existence on architecture as much as architecture relies for its construction, maintenance, expansion, and transformation on the dancers. So now you could see the connection with actually Monet's presentation. I think like his presentation was a preamble to mine. So yeah, I'm not very humble about it. So sound enables them to make each other. The space makes the women supernatural. The women make the space supernatural through the device of sound. The noise field intertwines their densities, right? It helps them make each other possible. In 7, sound, body, and space belong together in one entity. I've said it in 5 times now. The music weaves the supplicant, right? And I want to use this narrative of weaving the supplicant into the shrine, and it symmetrically involves women and buildings in each other's making. In other words, Tamal is not just a mystical ritual or a popular ritual or a folk ritual. It is a ritual of place-making in oral communities. Place-making is as much a visual exercise as it is an ordinary one. The acoustomusicologist Martin Stokes emphasized that, and I quote him, "What we know about ourselves and others and the space we create for ourselves, in addition to the visual cues, is built out of sound. Music," he continues, "is not simply something which happens in a social context. Music is not something just happens in a social context, but in a crucial sense, constitutive of a fundamental process of sociality itself. Music may even be usefully considered as a context in which events happen and without which they cannot." The end. Thank you so much. Yeah. All right, this is my last slide. Okay, thank you. Mhm.
Thank you so much, Chandana. That was really, really beautiful. I mean, it's also opened up so many ways of thinking, and this is something that we began with. What are some of the extant logics that South Asian sites produce that in many ways are erased by our declaration of this kind of self-determination of the utopian site? I mean, it kind of reminds me of the Munib. You probably I don't have this reference, but Kenneth Frampton is one of these big architectural historians who quotes Hannah Arendt and sort of talks about the site of public appearance. And Chandana completely through her presentation throws that public appearance, this idea of the cosmopolitan public appearance away by speaking of these women, who are possessed and occupy space in completely different ways. Through logics that perhaps are impossible to, map through the logics of modernity, enlightenment, and the idea of so-called progress. And so I think there's so much more to understand. And then you're kind of the whole sort of proposition of looking at this entanglement of sound, space, and body. What does that mean? Because that's another thing that has been, this idea of the subject and object has been, dissociated in so many ways in architecture. The body is a consumptive presence, that in some ways occupies space in consumptive ways. But here again, there is an enmeshing, there's an entanglement of space and body in very, very interesting ways. So I think there's a lot, and I mean, in some ways, it's something that we've been discussing at the school as well. In architectural pedagogies or architecture, in some ways, touches only 10% of the population. Our pedagogies address, and that's who our clients are, and these are the people who we are addressing. And I think there's more to do with money. It's more to do with who can come to you as a client. And I think what your presentation sort of tells us is that it's not that it's not that people don't have money, and it's just not that. It's not that these are not clients, but it's the logic of thinking itself, of who the subject of architecture is, and how you actually kind of look at this entanglement of the subject and architecture itself requires rethinking. So it's not it's not a simple argument saying that architecture is patron dependent, and these are the patrons who can come to you, but it's a ways of thinking of body space, people space, which themselves require complete rethinking. And I think both your presentations brought that out in very beautiful ways. And I think Monem was also speaking of this whole, I mean, in Puran Dhaka, there's this whole almost a kind of clash between people who look at heritage architecture, and this kind of huge problems that people have in being labeled as kind of people who are living in heritage spaces, because it with that in some ways also tends to objectify the space, preserve it. But I think Monim's work also kind of spoke about series of ways in which these kind of spaces bring in new questions, new materialities, new engagements, new ways of dealing with things. So I think there's so much more to in some ways decipher, in terms of what are some, I think it's really kind of an epistemic question to deal with. What are these extant logics, and how do we open those extant logics out to then challenge these teleological ways of looking at architecture, one way of looking at, almost sort of cleansing a site that is seen as unproductive, because a lot of these extant logics have been only seen through the lens of poverty, through, unruly undevelopment, unruly sites of being underdeveloped. Right. So these are ways in which we've been seeing a lot of the sites that we've been discussing right now. But then what are some of those other logics that one can actually start deciphering? So I think really beautiful. Maybe there's 15, I mean, maybe 10 more minutes. And what I can do is probably just share. It's not going to be, I mean, we have very little time, and we'll probably also kind of invite a couple of questions. So let's see where we go. I'm just going to see if I can, oh, okay, this is a new machine and I'm not seeing my, 1 second, I'm not, wow, sorry. Let me just open my.
Yeah, I was most excited by the synergy between what Munim presented and what I was presented. And I thought of it while you're putting this up as kind of what the scholarship and art practice from the South is doing to kind of, for the North, to rethink their very cleansed approach to these things, which is a part of how the literate world thinks about art, right? And I think like that is something that he opened up in his presentation.
Okay, I'm having a bit of a problem sharing this thing for some reason. SharePoint, I'm not seeing the presentation here. Sorry. It's a new machine. And
do you want to open it to Q&A meanwhile?
Yes, I think I'll do that. Does anyone have any questions right now by the time I kind of open these slides? Rohit, if you can help me, because I'm not able to see the Q&A. Just 1 second. I'm just going to share this with Dipti and Rohit, and if they can help me open the slide. Meanwhile, if anybody has any questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have shared the presentation. Dipti or Rohit, if y'all can open it, or meanwhile. I'm not seeing any, okay. I'm not seeing any questions here as yet. But I'm just going to probably, just can you go ahead? Because I'll skip this first part. This is this introduction I've already made. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, just 1 minute. Just 1 minute. I mean, this is something that I was discussing, that in some ways, this is a modern building in Mumbai. And it is basically this whole sort of argument that we've made, that, you know, that modernity was about progress, it's about equality, it's about freedom, and you know, and then if you look at very carefully, this is an Art Deco building, one of the most celebrated sites, you know, of modern architecture. And if you look closely, you see that you have 2 staircases. Okay, one staircase is for the people who are, you know, living in the building, and the other staircase is for the domestic workers. You know, and this is something that we saw recently in Chennai, which is, you know, again in the Indian Institute of Technology, IIT, which is again built in the 70s at the heights of modernity. You have a building with 3 staircases, right? One for the upper caste professors, the second is for the cook, and the third one is for the people who are going to come to clean your toilets. Yeah, and so I mean, there's a whole sort of way in which one understands this schizophrenia, right? Like the schizophrenic kind of occupation of space that modernity produced, and which is why I think it's also important to start looking at where, you know, as opposed to this claim of self-determination, what are other logics, and are those other logics, you know, kind of more conducive to ideas of spatial justice. And I think that's something that is very, very important for us. Like, how do you produce spatial justice, or how do you look at the logics that produce spatial justice that may not be just this kind of utopian claim, right? So can you go next? And this is again another interesting, I mean, of course, this is Chandigarh, right? When Chandigarh is built, you have series of sites. That's Burel, the village, which was almost sort of strangulated, you know, sitting right in the center of this place, which was a space of high density, you know, intensities, entanglements, and that's where the labor that kind of, that both built Chandigarh but also sustained Chandigarh lived. So you had a series of these villages and squatter settlements, and again, so there's this whole sort of dichotomy, and these are seen as sites of poverty, right? But there's a whole lot of productive logics through which these sites work. Just can we go next? Yeah, so I just want to very quickly introduce maybe four conceptual ideas of some of these spatial logics that I have encountered in our research in South Asia. The first one I call space as continuum. Just go ahead. Go next. Yeah, so this is sorry, go back. Yeah, so this is a painting made by a friend of ours who lives very close in the forest. He's a young boy, belongs to the Varli tribe, and he's made this painting of his house. What is interesting in this painting of the house is these two completely different epistemes. On the left-hand corner, you see this hut made of wattle and daub, and it's a kind of almost non-permanent house. It has to be built every 2 years, every 3 years, because it's made out of non-permanent material. It kind of goes into disrepair. But it's also part of this kind of logic of people rebuilding their houses in times of when they're not involved in other things. So it's like a whole cycle of life. And then also the way he's kind of drawn it, it's one corner, right? The central space is occupied by this huge water body that has animals and all kinds of things in it. So it also talks about this kind of simultaneous relationships that human and non-human beings have in this place. And in some ways also speaks of the house as a continuum. The house is small, but that is not the only house. This house is this entire environment around it. Right. So in some ways, speaking of this idea of an extended idea of the house that is not a propertied entity, right? On the other hand, on the right-hand side, you see this, the space of the colonial officer. Okay, the colonial officer who is surveying this site and mapping this site, and you see him on the top on the terrace. Of course, the way the house is drawn is also drawn with this kind of very thick lines. They're bold lines as opposed to the thin ephemeral lines of the house on the bottom left, right, which is his house. And this is like this kind of strong house, permanent house. And then you have this colonial officer standing on the top whose gaze is surveying this landscape, almost this kind of violent gaze of the surveyor. And that kind of the permanent house in some ways speaks of this idea of property, this idea of the bounded space where there's no real relationship between the inside and the outside. And these two epistemes have been somehow the one on the right has been seen as progress, right? Like the house on the left has to somehow lead to that. And it also kind of reflects in government policies. So for example, if somebody is building their house in this ephemeral material, they won't get grants. The government will not give loans. And what you need to do is, there's the whole discourse of pakka and kacha construction, right? If your house is pakka, that's the only time you will get money from the government. If it's kacha, you cannot, but it's impossible to live in those houses because they don't breathe, right? So people do all kinds of things. Then they build these houses, and then they'll tactically sort of build one storehouse and then make extensions for those spaces out of the ways in which they know how to build, and they know that they can live. So there's all kinds of ways in which these sites work, but these are strong epistemic ways in which we kind of look at what is development and what is not. So how do we really sort of look at these other ways of living, the ideas of extended homes, the ideas of impermanence in the way we actually kind of think of building. Can you just go to the next one? Yeah. So this is again in the same site. And this idea of the extended home, and this is a recent photograph made by students of the 3rd semester. And this is, again, all these houses that you see belong to one family. So there's this whole sort of extended idea of the home where each one of them live in each other's houses. So the whole cluster becomes one big home. And I think, again, that's important, that it's not a kind of closed, propertied idea of the home, but a kind of shared collaborative space that people kind of work with and live with. Let's go next. This is a very recent photograph. We had gone for a study trip to Orcha. And this is when, again, similar to the kind of policies that I was talking about, the government would give people these boxes, these kind of boxes to live in. But what people did was magical. They built these plinths and extended parts of the home completely themselves. Because it's impossible to live in those boxes. Your life is actually lived outdoors in shared ways with other people. And they did this really beautiful, almost this kind of landscape extension to their own home. So these boxes were like the plinths and the extended verandas, and all of that became ways in which people intervened in this kind of bureaucratic space of the box and the propertied idea of the space that was provided to them. Just go next. Yeah, just go next. Yeah, I mean, this is a whole lot of the outdoor living is extremely important, and that's something that one doesn't understand at all. Just go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, and this is again the second, like the idea of the home as the space as continuum, home as continuum. The second one is the site of multiple claims, right? And this is it's a dargah in Mumbai. And if you see that dargah is in the center, but on all the sides are these extended properties. These are shops, and these shops are sometimes no more than 1 foot wide. It's a kind of 1 foot depth, which is embedded in the wall of the shop. And there's a whole sort of relationship between a symbiotic relationship. They pay some nominal rent to the other space. And then in return, it's also a kind of financial mechanism for the dargah. And in some ways, again, our logics or modern logics of locating property absolutely doesn't understand this, right? Like, so you would have today something like a GIS map made, and the GIS map requires very clear polygons, and those polygons will have certain attributes of who owns something. But what happens with these kind of logics where the property is just a wall, or there is something, there's a kind of shop nestled within another shop, or it's kind of very interesting relationships through which people claim space, right? Which is impossible to think of through this idea of clear property. Let's go next. Just go through more the sites of impermanence. There's been this colonial almost this kind of really kind of pushing of the logic of permanence, right? We tended to, like we saw that first image, the colonial officer's house was a permanent space, and you really kind of think of spaces that are impermanent as underdeveloped. But this is a really, Munim will know this case. This is in Bangladesh, sites that are prefabricated by sets of carpenters for places that will get inundated, right? That will kind of get flooded. So you have series of these. Just go ahead. We'll move a little bit quicker into this because you see these photographs. That's the kitchen space at the back. Go ahead. Go ahead. Very beautiful. I mean, it's almost like a backpack house, right? Like a house that you can take with you and go elsewhere, because the land, just 1 second, sorry, just stop. Because the land is kind of shifting and changing, and that's the nature of the land itself, right? So you kind of carry your house with you, you take it away with you. And just that slide before this, it's kind of sitting on the stilts, and the side before this is the Gorer Haat, right? Like the house market. This is a place where you can go to buy your house, right? A kind of prefabricated house. That one can, and also the sizes of those houses are different. You can buy a small 1-room house, a 2-room house, depends on your kind of financial capability. And sometimes if you're in financial crisis, you can also sell parts of your house. So in some ways, this kind of interesting logics in the way this kind of house of the impermanent works and questions of impermanence work. So just last one, I'll just take you to the last one and then we'll end. Sites of incrementality. Again, just this is a site in Mumbai, which is built incrementally, in some ways that I mean, this is a self-built settlement, and it has been built in. I mean, these are people who cannot afford formal housing. And so what they do is they'll claim a certain site, they will kind of build incrementally and just go next. This was a project, this was a slum sanitation project that was, that kind of worked across 300 sites in Mumbai, and worked through kind of NGOs and contractors who got huge amount of government kind of foreign funding to build these. And all of them built these large toilet blocks in this particular slum. It also was a tick mark in the reports, in the kind of financial reporting that they had to do. Just go next. However, there were people on the lower level, the municipal staff at the lower level, realized that these large infrastructure buildings, these toilets that were built in the slums, were, they would break down very quickly, right? Because it's difficult to maintain them. So as against this kind of large projects, they started upgrading the sites. They worked with lower level contractors to lay pipes in the settlement, and then they took them to individual people's houses. Go next. So that's what you see, that this is a settlement that has this infrastructure. Go next. And then, they worked with non-standard ways. So there were people who did not have toilets inside their space to build the toilet inside. And what the community would then get together and find place outside in the lanes for people to build the toilets. And in some ways it was a much more dignified way of having this kind of infrastructure than that large toilet building in the middle, where women had to go with buckets and wait in lines, and also had to wait for the men to go to to work and then use the space after that. So in some ways, this kind of logics that work in non-standardized ways, in ways in which they work with the lower level contractors and people who are already upgrading the site. And this, in some ways, became a much more dignified site than even the kind of the slum redevelopments that are built in ways that actually benefit developers. That in some ways relax norms of light and ventilation and other things. Go next. So yeah, go next. Yeah, sorry, this is the last slide actually. So the last one, and this is the proposition again, sites of enjoyment. And I think like Chandana, you presented this kind of site of, the site of this kind of ecstatic space, right? Just go next. This is a person who had a small shop in a place called Lamington Road, a place where you get computer peripherals. And he was, he sort of had, his father was a tailor, okay? So he did not want to kind of continue his tailoring business. So instead, he started selling LED lights. And the way he kind of sold LED, he was obsessed with these LED lights that had come from China. And he grew up watching this, a Bollywood musical by this actor called Amitabh Bachchan, who would wear this light suit, okay? And he would kind of dance around, and all of us grew up watching Amitabh Bachchan wearing this light suit. So this young boy who opened this shop that sold light suit, that sold LED lights, asked his father to stitch him a LED light suit. And he would walk around Lamington Road wearing this LED light suit, becoming that shop, this embodiment of the shop himself. And so I want to end there saying that, these are things that these registers are somehow something that we don't consider. This idea of the space of enjoyment that kind of also produce multiple sites in South Asia is something that one perhaps does not kind of look at or consider when one thinks of the idea of producing space. So thanks so much. I'll just end there. And I think, of course, this is...
We're out of time, right?
Yes, we are out of time.
Okay, excellent. Okay.
But, Chandana, you want to say something?
No, I'm good.
Yeah. No, I think of course, we're completely out of time. And the next panel, I can see Jim is already there. Hi, Jim. So the next panel is also very interesting. It's on drawing, and it's called Drawing Babel. But I think, and of course, this is not going to be, there's 1.5 hours is not enough. But I think what we kind of bring together on this panel is to start deciphering what are some of the other logics through which we can understand space. How do we kind of think of ways in which we can completely rethink our ways of looking at architecture from logics that are perhaps completely inadequate, inadequate and sort of you almost sort of unidimensional. So yeah, I mean, unless both of you want to just add maybe a line or two.
I would just say one thing that I think like what this panel is doing, and I guess the whole symposium, but also your school is doing, is actually there has been after Edward Said's book on Orientalism, there was a first wave of post-colonial critique, which was to say the West describes the Orient in ways that doesn't do them justice. I think now is a moment where the South, the global South, is beginning to describe itself, not critique the North, right? That part is like no longer, nobody's doing critique of that type. That's not viable because it's been done for 50 years. Now it's time to speak back, I would say, right? And weave these new kinds of epistemological frameworks, which weave the intelligence that's coming from European Enlightenment movement together with the Southern and global South kind of types of epistemologies, as well as scholarship and artistic practice. I think like Munem kind of woke me up to that as well, right? And a lot of people are doing this kind of work, which is focusing on informality, focusing on these in a failed state, right? Which is what happens, and the energy of sound, right? Energy of noise and the politics of noise. So I think like that to me is something that's a sea shift. Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
I will just add one line. Listening to all of you, this idea of extended home, or to understand what it means to live a life beyond what we look at now in modern time boxes. And I told you this little story, Rupali. There's this documentary on Bismillah Khan, where he says that where people invites him to move to Paris and New York, he said, of course, I'm ready to move anywhere else if you can take the river which is next to my house with me to Paris and New York. And of course, that river is not a home, it's a space where he wakes up and stand and breathe and he sings. And that relation which is beyond these 4 lines, or how we draw. And the drawing you showed of that Warley painter, and it talks about a different kind of epistemes living together. It's not only human beings, there are plants, there are insects, there are different kind of marks. And I think that makes our life in South Asia so interesting, that sometimes we miss when we look at from just certain rigid perspectives.
Right, absolutely. And I think we can sort of also extend that to kind of think of what does it mean not to look at South Asia, but also look from South Asia, right? Like look at the world from South Asia. So I think that will be that sort of be really interesting. And I think with that, I'm going to stop this panel.
Yes, thank you.
And I'll invite you to join. I think the other 2 panelists are here already, Chitra and Jim. So both of them are they're both architects as well as artists, and have been doing really interesting work on drawing. And some of these questions that we've been asking on this panel will, I think, also extend in the next panel. So I'll invite Chandana and Munem to also continue being there if they can. But I will invite.
Can we just stay on this point,
yes,
or should we just? Okay, thank you.
You can stay here. Yeah. Okay. And I will just look for Apurva is going to be moderating your panel. So I think Apurva will be joining soon.